Dr. Catherine Wihtol de Wenden. Welcome and thank you so much for your patience.
So I was asked to speak about the new structural factors of migration, and I wanted to come back to your first problematics, which is migration and poverty, which is a very good one. Even if poverty in many cases don't lead to international migration. The poorest in the world don't go very far. So most of them are internal migrants due to environmental questions, due to many agricultural problems. And so now we have around 800,000 million internal migrants, while we have 285 million migrants in the world. So the internal migrants are much more than the international migrants in the world, and the poorest are going first to internal migration, perhaps after to reach international migrations, but it is not the case for all. I wanted to stress on this topic. Now, as said Stephen Castles and many others, we have entered in an age of migration, because migration is a structural phenomenon of the world. And I shall try to focus on some factors which are the most important ones leading to international migration. And if we have time in the question, I shall also speak about internal migration factors. So as for international migration, the structural factor which have transformed a world which is more and more moving are linked with the interconnection and the interdependencies of the world. The first phenomenon, the first structural factor, as it was said before, are the inequalities of human development. If we take the three criteria adopted by Amartya Sen, the Indian economist who proposed to have a quantitative approach of poverty, seeing the educational level, the share of the gross national product for each member of a state, and the life expectancy, we see that sub-Saharan Africa is the most impacted region in the world with the inequalities of human development. I have made an atlas of migration which is showing that. And another very important factor is demography. Demography, now we have quite 8 billion people on the planet, and there are a lot of differences in the demographic growth around the world, especially with some countries and some regions which are decreasing in population, but not only decreasing, like Europe, Russia, even the United States, Canada, and so on, but also which are going older and older. So this is a structural factor which also leads to migration, because there are a lot of jobs which cannot be held by old people, such as construction industry, agriculture, but also very also qualified jobs. We are lacking also of qualified jobs in the world, especially doctors, especially if the population is getting older and older, and care of old people, care of children, and so on. So the demographic phenomenon is very important. For example, the median age in Europe is 41 years old, dividing in two equal parts the population of Europe. But in Maghreb, it is 25 years. So the population is much younger. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is 18 years old. So half of the population is more or less than 18 years old, which is a very heavy cost for the countries, because they have to educate a huge population of young who are also wanting to get jobs at the end, which is not so easy. And other structural phenomena also are linked to the trends of the world, which are refugees. We have met a lot of crises of refugees during these last 20 years. I take the example of Afghanistan, 6.5 million refugees from Afghanistan since the 1980s, for example. Iraq, 4.5 million Iraqis abroad. Also Syria, with 4.5 million Syrians abroad. Ukrainian crisis with 8.5 million Ukrainians out of their country. But this population also are including sometimes not just those who are abroad, but also the displaced inside their country. All of these countries are not very poor in this crisis. It is true for Sudan, for some places, but not necessarily in this refugee crisis, including the Venezuela, which led to 4.5 Venezuelans abroad. They are not the poorest, but the crises also are a very important factor of migration of refugees now in the world, with huge figures. Other factors, also the mobility of the qualified students, elite people, who want, as it was said, to have a better way of life, but also freedom, and to meet their hopes for their way of life abroad, which is more and more important. Linked with information, media are a very important factor, because it is linking transnationally the people, the candidates to departure to the countries where they want to go. And sometimes the gap, economic gap, demographic gap, political gap, are very important in very short geographic distances. I take the example of the Mediterranean region between the north and the south, but also, for example, between Mexico and the US, but also Central America and Mexico, Russia and China. There are a lot of examples in the world where the gap leading to migration is very important in a very small geographic distance. And the gap is visible at the TV. It is visible on the website. It is visible on the cell phones and so on. So people are more and more connected with the way of life they want to go, and this is also creating a kind of desire of international migration. Other factors are also the offer of mobility, which is offered by trafficking. Trafficking is a very important economy in countries like Libya, for example, and very important resource, which takes the economy of poor countries and poor families, poor people who try to gather all their economies in the dream of the travel, which is very difficult with a lot of dead people. I take the example of the Mediterranean region, 50 million dead in the Mediterranean since the 1990s, and perhaps which is much more, but just those who were found, and just for last year, 3 million people dead in the Mediterranean during the year 2022. So it is a very important phenomenon, but also other structural factors as the climate. Climate is not leading to far migration, but more to internal migration for 2/3 of this population, but also it leads to the mobility, which is not shown, but which is linked to the climate and shortages in agriculture and also desertification and some other factors. And among these also structural factors, there are the development of tourism, which is not migration, but which is leading to a use of mobility, which also brings people to consider that mobility is a right. And now there is also in this structural factor a legal aspiration to mobility, because the problem of visa is crucial. If you have the chance to have a European, American, Canadian passport, you are Japanese or South Korean, you can move without visa in a lot of countries in the world, 190. If you are from Somalia, from Sudan, from some Afghanistan, you are at the least in the fight. So you can go quite everywhere, except for countries which are close to your country, which is in situation of poverty and war. So the question of the right to mobility linked with the visa system, which is linked by the notion of migration risk for the poorest, for those who are coming from countries which are in situations of war or in poverty, is a very important issue. And now the right to mobility in a world where 2/3 of the population in the world cannot move freely is a very important topic. So especially at South. So the question is not just economic, not just demographic, not just linked to forced migration of refugees, but it is also forced to a notion of equality of rights and the question of equality of the right to mobility, democratizing mobility, as says the philosopher Etienne Balibar, for example, is a very important issue. So as for the structural factors of mobility, how is it lived by the migrants themselves? Most of the researches which have been done in the south of the world, now there are quite the same number of south-south and north-south migration than the migration from south to north and north-north migration. We have quite 140 million, which are south-north and north-north migration, than south-south and north-south migration. 140 million at world level for international migration. So for the people of the south, so we have to remember that most south-south migration never move to the north, because it is very difficult. The poorest never move to the north, even if it is a dream and very dangerous dream. So in this situation, migration is lived like a kind of insurance in countries, in poor countries, where there is no other possibility to have perspectives if somebody in the family does not move. So migration is an insurance in case of health disease, in case of environmental disease, floods or dry catastrophes. In cases of a lot of unemployment of the youth and also of the head of the family. So it is migration can be a solution for all these questions. In cases of all the catastrophes which can exist in the life are solved according to the population who decide to move by migration, because the remittances are very important. $550 billion were sent last year by migrants to their regions and countries of origin. So it is 3 times more than the public help to development. The most important investor to the well-being in his country or in her country is the migrant. It is very important, the remittances. And these remittances correspond to the aspiration of a better well-being of the populations. It can be in cities, more and more in cities, but also in rural areas. And it is mostly an insurance towards the many insecurities, economic, political, health insecurities that exist in the poorest countries. So migration will go on, because of these structural factors. And I shall finish by saying another challenge is for a lot of immigration countries. I have to add that in the south, some countries have become, are still immigration countries, but are now also transit and immigration countries, especially for those who are close to the gap I was speaking about with rich countries. We take the example of Maghreb countries are becoming countries of immigration too, for example, and Mexico and many others. The important challenge is that these countries, including Europe, who never considered itself as a region of immigration, of settlement, of long-term settlement, the same for Japan, the same for many regions, have to consider themselves, due to these structural factors of migration, which will last a long time, because development is a far issue, but presently all these factors of mobilities are still there, these factors of migration, of international migration. So they have to consider themselves as continents or region, not of migration for short term, for hosting refugees or for just labor force, but for migration of settlement. And for them, it is a very important challenge. Adopting, for example, rights, more open rights to access to citizenship, adopting diversity in their definition of citizenship, having more room for considering the legitimacy of migration as making the identity of their countries. And in this period of increasing populism, it is not the case for many of these countries. But it is also true at South. At South, if we take the example of Maghreb countries or Mexico, many other countries which are transit zones, this challenge is also very important. It is because the topic of discrimination, the topic of open rights to the newcomers, the topic of opening more hospitality to refugees, the topic of making a country with migrants is also a very important challenge, because the structural factors of migration will last a long time, and the world has to accept it has become a world of more and more mobility. Perhaps I shall stop here.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you. I just want to go back when you reminded us that, you know, and this is what I was also finding in literature as I was researching, that the poor of the poorest don't usually migrate. Or if they do, they don't migrate far. The opportunity to migrate further than what we thought they do is not often there. The cost is too much. And earlier on, I had asked Tess about, you know, the migrant network and how important those are. And if they don't have access to these migrant networks, it makes it very difficult for them to be able to move. So thank you so much for sharing that part.